Hey friends, welcome to Shifting Culture. This show exists because of you, your curiosity, your care, your belief that deep, honest conversations matter, and it's also sustained by you. We're listener supported, which means that if you find value here, you can help keep it going. For as little as $5 a month at shiftingculture.substack.com, you'll get ad-free early access episodes, bonus shows, and reflections I don't share anywhere else. It's more than support, it's partnership. And I'm grateful you're here. So go to shiftingculture.substack.com and subscribe for as little as $5 a month. And now, on with the show.
If we all have our own unique gifts, we all have our unique desires and our own kind of contribution to peace, then we all better be up and about the work, because it takes all of us to build this peace, to build up God's dream of peace in the world, and to go out and do it.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. You know, we are living in a world that seems to be unraveling at the seams, where chaos, polarization, and anxiety have become our default settings. We need a different way of being. So today, I'm sitting down with Eric Clayton, who's been wrestling with the question, what if peace isn't just the absence of conflict, but a transformative way of living? Eric's new book, Finding Peace Here and Now, isn't just another self-help manual. It's an invitation, a roadmap drawn from Ignatian spirituality that challenges us to look deeper. How do we build peace when everything around us seems designed to tear us apart? How do we find stillness in the storm, not by escaping the world, but by showing up differently? We'll explore how peace starts within us, how it's cultivated through compassion, creativity, and a willingness to see the humanity in everyone, even those we disagree with. This isn't about being passive. It's about a strength so profound it can disarm violence without raising a hand. So, if you're feeling overwhelmed, if you're searching for hope in a world that seems to have lost its way, this conversation is for you. So join us as we walk through what peace really means. Here is my conversation with Eric Clayton. Eric, welcome to Shifting Culture. Thanks for joining me. Excited to have you on.
Joshua, glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
I love this book, Finding Peace Here and Now, and it's, I think, one of the most important things for us today. It seems to me like this world is full of chaos and suffering,
Yes.
loss, polarization, and we're anxious all the time, and we need to find some peace. So it's pretty important. But I know that you, in your life, you've been drawn to peace building, peacemaking. You've been drawn to, of course, Ignatian spirituality. Where did those threads come together for you? How did peacemaking and Ignatian spirituality mesh in your own life?
Yeah, I'll start with the peacemaking part of it. As an undergraduate student and then as a graduate student, the work of peace, right? Peace building as a profession really enchanted me. It sounded really cool. It sounded really important. It sounded like you're on the front lines of big things. I studied international studies as an undergraduate at a Jesuit school, Fairfield University in Connecticut. And I studied international media at American University with a focus on peace. How can we talk of and tell stories of peace? So peace was always in that mindset of professional life. And then I worked at Catholic Relief Services, which is an international nonprofit humanitarian relief organization for the Catholic Church in the U.S. for a number of years. And they have a really great peace program. And so I worked with some of those colleagues kind of tangentially, always thinking, I'll get into this work eventually. I just need to, wait for my time to come. My time never came, despite studying it and reading it and talking about it. And it was discouraging in some ways. But I remember I have a very distinct memory. My wife was the young adult minister at our parish many years ago when we were still young adults. And we read a book about peace. And during that time, I was still in graduate school. I was reading a lot of other books on peace, and not just academic books, but these kind of prayer books. How do we pray about peace? And I realized what I'm doing here, and we realized this in community, essentially, was peace is for all of us. Peace it is a profession for some, but in fact, it's an invitation for all. And here I was waiting for the line on my resume that said, "Hey, you're a peace builder," when in fact, I've been wasting all this time, failing to do the work of peace, whatever that meant. Some of us are called to be on the front lines in a very literal sense. Some of us are called to be all of us, I think, are called to be very mindful and intentional of the words we use and the images we share and things that can share little glimpses of peace or can contribute to violence toward ourselves, violence towards others. So that was a deepening realization of what the invitation of peace meant. And it's a real gospel call, right? We're ever deepening into peace. Where Ignatian spirituality comes into play. Again, as I said, I went to a Jesuit university, went to a Jesuit parish, and now I work for the Jesuit Conference of Canada, United States. So I'm professionally tied to the Jesuits. I myself am not a Jesuit, but Ignatian spirituality is really how I understand kind of our gospel call, and that's all about vocation. It's all about what is God asking us to do? How is God showing us, by in the patterns of our lives, what we're called to do? And the more I kind of pray with that, the more I am convinced that if we paid closer attention and really understood, God has given me this unique task to do. God has given me these gifts. God is asking me to be with these people, and kept our focus on the here and now, rather than wishing, I'm so jealous of this person because they have such a cool job, or this other person has so much money, or I wish I could do this even though, I wish I could be a doctor even though blood makes me queasy, right? All these things that aren't necessarily ours to do. There's a lot of unpeace that happens as a result. So I think Ignatian spirituality has a lot to say about that. So that's kind of where those two lines came together: Ignatian spirituality and peace. And I can say more, of course, but that, I think, for my own prayer, that was where that desire came out of.
Peace for you felt like a calling, like I want to be a part of it. You're drawn to it, but also then that this Ignatian spirituality, this thing of discerning what is mine to do, what has God given me to do in this world, and how can I be a person of peace in my everyday life, what God has called me into. And so a lot of times we're in this place of looking at people and places and things and saying, I haven't arrived yet. I want to be there. What grounded you? What helped you move from the space of looking at others, saying, I wish I had that, to being grounded, saying, I have what I have, and I could show up in the world as somebody full of peace?
Well, I would say that my disclaimer is always I think every time I went
You're
through
working on it. You're a work in progress, I'm sure.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly right. And it's funny because every time I read, you're working on a book, you read it, so many times, you're editing it and you're like, man, oh man, this makes a lot of sense to me. I wish I was better at it. I wrote it. It's that kind of thing. You're like, I'm not there yet. I think about myself as a writer, right? That would be kind of one of the identities I would cling to. And how easy it is to compare my book sales to someone else's book sales, to say, someone wrote this great essay, but my essays are good too. Why aren't people talking about them? Or I could write this so much better, but no one is recognizing me. Right? It's so easy, even in our own vocation, to compare and to kind of wallow in this desolation. At the same time, missing the people that say, hey, this thing you wrote was really, really helpful. Hey, this chapter in the book really spoke to me. Or, hey, please come talk, give a retreat, or whatever it is. All these other glimpses of consolation. So a challenge for me, and I think probably for listeners too, is we always have those moments of God kind of smiling at us and God delighting in us and God saying, you're already here. Wake up, pay attention, do the good work. You're not meant to, and maybe you're meant to be the New York Times bestseller, but that's not important. Right now, we're focused on caring for the people in front of you, caring for the people that are already reading your book, whatever it might be. I remember, I'll tell you a story. When I worked at Catholic Relief Services a number of years ago, I would take a shuttle from kind of a northern neighborhood in Baltimore City downtown to where CRS had its world headquarters. And on the shuttle every morning would be all of these Johns Hopkins students. So all of these folks, training to be or already doctors, nurses, people of great skill. And I would sit there and I'd be, wow. I would think to myself, like, what a loser you are, Eric. Like, what are you doing, for God's people? You're just riding down the bus to kind of do some, silly writing on your computer. And these folks are really saving lives. And I would have that thought, knowing full well, I don't study science. I don't have any. I took like one science elective in undergrad. I don't do well with any sort of anatomy, biology, physics, chemistry, none of that stuff. Both like at an intellectual level, and also it makes me queasy. Like, why would God be calling me to do this work? God is calling me to do a different kind of work, and so I can sit around and waste time and by wishing I was somebody else, or I could celebrate that God has given these good skills to these good people, and hopefully, is those people are doing good, and then I can go back to my own work. And I think that's a real pivot, celebrating the skills of others versus wallowing in what we think we don't have instead of missing what we already do.
I think it's going to be helpful for people to kind of define what Ignatian spirituality is. I know that probably a lot of people listening are familiar with it. Some people may not be. So what is Ignatian spirituality, and what did St. Ignatius give the world?
Well, briefly, so Ignatian spirituality comes from kind of the life and legacy, the teaching, the spiritual reflections of Saint Ignatius of Loyola. Ignatius of Loyola was a Basque soldier, nobleman, man about court who lived in late 1400s, early 1500s to mid 1500s. He in Spain. He had this moment. He was this soldier. He has this moment that we kind of say this is the cannonball moment during the Battle of Pamplona. He's a part of a Spanish battalion that's outnumbered, outmaneuvered by the French forces, who offer them terms of surrender. Ignatius says, "No, we will not surrender," even though he's not in charge of the battalion. Convinces all of the troops, including the commanding officer, to go along with him, and they are completely routed. People are killed, lives are lost because of Ignatius's pride, his inability to surrender, which is always worth reflecting on. Ignatius himself gets a cannonball to the leg. His legs are broken. Because he's a noble, he's brought back to his home in Loyola. He recovers for 11 months. During that time period, he's given 2 books, The Life of Christ and The Life of the Saints. And as he's there, as he's recovering, he realizes that the old stories he used to find so energizing, the stories of courtly romance and chivalric heroics, are no longer energizing him like they once did. Now, as he thinks about the life of Christ, as he thinks about the lives of the saints, he finds himself really moved by this kind of a different kind of heroism. What would it mean to give my life to this greater cause? What would it mean to live a life of humility and poverty and embracing this downward mobility that Christ invites us to? What would that be? He's energized by that. And so right there at that beginning, we see this discernment of spirits. He's recognizing God, inviting him to something else, working in his imagination. From his recovery, he then goes on. He lays his sword down at the foot of Our Lady of Montserrat, which is an image of the Blessed Mother in Spain, and he picks up this title of this role of pilgrim. And then he spends time in Manresa, which is not far from Montserrat, praying, reflecting, and ultimately having this profound experience of God. From this experience of God, he writes what's known as the spiritual exercises. The spiritual exercises is this 4-week retreat, or we can think of it in 4 spiritual movements. That's really inviting folks to mirror what Ignatius did. Ignatius was a master of understanding the human psyche, the human condition. You go on this spiritual journey to better understand what God is calling you to do, right? That call of vocation. And then Ignatius goes on, he meets other companions, he founds the Society of Jesus, or better known as the Jesuits. And here we are, almost 500 years later. So Ignatian spirituality takes a lot from the spiritual exercises, from the tradition of the Jesuits, and also from this early experience of Ignatius understanding God working in his imagination, God calling him to new things, to make these choices between various paths in life, and also God being present in all things. It's a key thing for Ignatian spirituality. God is present in all things. All things can reveal to us something of God's desire for us in our lives. Ignatius says, right, the human person is made to praise, reverence, and serve God, and by that way then save our souls and work for the good of all people. But how we praise, reverence, and serve God, that's the key, right? That's the vocational question, and that's what the spiritual exercises and all these other tools of the Ignatian tradition are about. So it's a long answer to your question, but I think understanding Ignatius's life is really key. And then Ignatian spirituality, there's much more we can talk about there, but that the idea of God in all things is really, really important.
So because God is in all things, we can be in the world. Talk a little bit how Jesuits are a little different than other religious orders that we think of, that they may not have a typical housing place, but they're out in the world. And how is that different? And why is that important?
So when Ignatius and the early kind of Jesuit companions founded the society, it was a moment in church history that looked very different, because the idea of having a religious order that didn't live in a monastery, didn't live apart from the world was unheard of. Today we might think, oh yeah, we see kind of religious folks all over the place, but in that time it was a real break with the tradition, or an evolution of the tradition, you might say. And so one of the early Jesuits, I believe it was Jerome Nadal, said something to the effect of kind of the world is our monastery. It's a paraphrase, but that meant that for a Jesuit, and I would say for anybody who kind of, is in this Ignatian tradition, we go into the world knowing God is here, knowing that is in this space that we pray, that we encounter God's desire and dream for us, and we do the work of God. There's a phrase again in the Ignatian tradition, being a contemplative in action. That means that prayer is so important, because it's how we understand and make sense of God's will in our lives. But then we necessarily are compelled to go out into the world and have an impact on the common good. What is God asking of us uniquely in this moment? So it's that constant cycle of reflecting on the needs of the world, reflecting on what God is inviting us to do uniquely, and then going out and doing it.
I think contemplative in action is something that has resonated with almost more than anything. As I've been, working in the world, trying to figure out my life with Christ, my life in the world. This is the thing that's really stuck with me. I was talking to my wife last night and talking about you. I'm going to interview you, talk about Ignatian spirituality. And we've been teaching some mission courses on the history of mission. And she was like, hey, I don't know where we would be without the Jesuits. Like they were in the world when nobody else was in the world. It was the Jesuits that really kept it going when it felt like there was a moment of silence and quiet, that we're out in the world. I think the key is contemplative. Like you're finding peace in yourself so that you can find peace in the world. What is that balance? How do we start? So take us into a moment, say maybe in this 4-week Ignatius exercises, the spiritual exercises, how do we start to find that peace within ourselves so that we can be peace builders, peacemakers within the world?
Yeah, I think a lot of it really, at least for me in my own kind of prayer life, right? It comes from finding what God has been up to in my life, right? And detecting those patterns. How has God already been at work in my life? Again, in the Ignatian tradition, we talk about the graced history, looking at our history with God, and realizing God is already working, is already doing stuff. We may not make sense of it for years on end, but God has always been there. And so in the first week of the exercises, one of the key themes is, right, to really look clearly at the world and to say, things are not quite right here. There's a lot of suffering. There's a lot of disorder. There's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of need. Yeah, I know. I don't want to, no spoiler. I don't want to spoil that for you, but things are a little bit of a mess, but you see things as they are plainly, right? And then you see God inviting you all the same, and God saying, hey, guess what? I want you to not be stuck in this broken status quo. In fact, I want you to step out and to help to change it, help to make it better, right? So I think to do that, there's a lot of things that have to happen. I think we have to find our own vocation, right? What is it God's asking us to do? What are we good at? What brings us that peace? And then how can we offer it to others? Because we can never, one of the things, in the book is you reflect on peace as like an academic concept, right? And this is going to be obvious when I say it, but conflict only takes one person. Just takes one guy or girl, whatever, to start a war, and then everything crumbles. But it takes every single party involved to build peace, right? And so, you think about that. If we all have our own unique gifts, and we all have our unique desires, and our own kind of contribution to peace, then we all better be up and about the work, because it takes all of us to build this peace, to build up God's dream of peace in the world, and to go out and do it. So I think as we're thinking about the exercises, that we begin in chaos, which just means we begin by looking at the status quo that is far from what we hope for, and then we begin to say, well, what comes next? And in the flow of the exercises, the second week and the second movement is this invitation to accompany Jesus as Jesus is about his mission. And then we begin to see them. What do we see in that mission? We see Jesus working wonders. We see Jesus healing and upsetting the status quo, because suddenly everybody belongs, everybody matters, everybody is worthy of a touch of comfort and compassion. And we're walking with Jesus as he does this. One of the things I hope for this book is it does parallel the exercises. It goes through. So you could read it as an introduction to the exercises. You could read it while you're making that retreat with the director. And I hope that it offers a little bit of new insight as folks are doing that.
2 weeks ago, my wife went through a week of guided prayer with somebody, and they did an imaginative prayer exercise and then a reflection every day. And then the director that was walking with her would give her a new passage, and a passage as she was reflecting on what was going on in this, what's a good passage for this imaginative prayer. And it's pretty transformative during that time. It's like, take me into what that is as an exercise, and how maybe in your own life, how that has helped you as you've encountered Jesus in your imagination and put yourself in the story.
There's two gospel passages that were really important to my own kind of faith journey. One being kind of Jesus being baptized, right? And God arriving and saying, "You are the beloved. You are my beloved." And another being the parable of the prodigal son. I mean, you can see common themes, right? Again, that embrace, like, hey, like you matter. Set aside the shame. You're good, right? So you have common themes in those. The one that I think is probably easiest in some ways, and I do write about this in the book, is the Jesus at the being baptized at the Jordan River. The idea there. My own spiritual director, long ago, he said, did you know God delights in you? Do you know God? You're the beloved of God. And I didn't. I really didn't. This was I was an undergraduate then, but I think there's a lot of people still, and even now, like, you have to practice that. Oh yeah, God delights in me. Oh my goodness, God delights in me. That's not always easy to remember or to live out of. And so that's why you take this abstract truth and you put yourself in the scene. And so if we're going to walk in the scene of the baptism of Jesus, right, in the Ignatian tradition, you would put yourself in and you would say, okay, who am I in this scene? Maybe I'm Jesus, and I think that's probably the best character to be in this particular gospel passage. But regardless of what the passage is, am I a character who's named? Am I maybe a new character I'm imagining kind of on the sidelines? And now once I'm in the scene, I kind of see it, right? I assemble the scene in my mind. What do I feel? Do I feel the sand kind of grating on my skin? Is it hot out? The sun is burning my neck. What do I smell? Is that the smell of the river? Is it the smell of am I passing by a meat stand? Like, what is it? What am I seeing? Right? You're really engaging the senses, because again, right, that initial piece of Ignatius's story, the imagination is key. If we're doing the story of the baptism, right? What does it feel like to have John the Baptist put his hand on my head and push me under the water and then pull me back up, right? That moment of silence and then that moment of light. And then God says to me, Eric, you are my beloved. I am well pleased with you, right? What does that feel like? And so for you to do that, or your wife to do, or anyone to do that in their prayer, what does that mean for God to say that? And what I would hope, right? I think that one of the hopes of that prayer would be, what does it unlock? What does it mean when suddenly we look at our life and say, oh my goodness, I'm not just the beloved of God now, I've always been the beloved of God. Does that change what it means to look at my life? That doesn't mean it removes hard times or suffering or we don't bandy over challenges, right? But we find that God is there with us, right? Jesus weeps with us. God cries out with us, right? There's that companionship of God in even hard moments because God loves us. What do we do with those we love? We sit with them. We let them cry on our shoulder. We cry with them, right? It changes how we understand ourselves in relationship with God. And that's just one scripture passage, right? We can go on, but I won't.
I think that changes everything. If we sit with the belovedness, like we are the beloved, I think that's a different posture in the world than we often have. I think most people are often striving to achieve something so they could get approval from others. But if you start from that position, that changes the way that you enter into the world. That changes the way you see yourself. That changes the way that you actually do have some peace in the world. It's pretty incredible. You've done this exercise, but when did it actually seep into your life that you are beloved? And how did that change you?
I don't know if it's like a one-time thing. I think it's a constant unfurling. You're absolutely right. Like if we are beloved, it's like if you're, like with a beloved in your own life, right? Who is the beloved in your life? It could be friends, could be family, could be spouses, it could be children. There's a sense of no matter whatness in the love, right? That you're giving. And so it does bring, as you said, that peace. I'm doing okay. I always have this relationship. It affirms me, not because of what I'm doing, because of who I am, right? It sounds like cliches and trite, sound bites, but it's true. So, I mean, I was a sophomore junior in college, right? When I first had this introduced to me by my spiritual director at the time, it was very profound. It was a key moment in my life. Really kind of turned me I say, oh, you know what? This spiritual stuff, this prayer life really matters. Spending time in prayer really matters. And there's a lot of consolation to come from it, because it means that God is active in my world, right? It's God isn't just on the page or at a distance, but again, God is in all things. So all things are revealing that delight of God. Now, I was a junior in college. That was however many years ago. A lot has happened since then, right? So every time you return to those scripture stories, every time you return, you put yourself back in the scene. You hear that sense of belovedness. You bring it into the moment. Oh, wow, I'm beloved. Wait, I should make sure I'm really mindful of how I treat my kids. Oh, I'm a beloved. Wow, who in the headlines needs me to really kind of think, offer a prayer for them, or think more intentionally about how I'm living my life, right? It brings you into dialogue with the moment, and I think that's why we return to Scripture, right, again and again. We're never surprised by the ending. It's because we're bringing our lived experience through the story of Scripture back into our lived experience and saying, well, what is God doing now through me? Which goes back to what we're saying, right? It's that sense of I am enough, and yet God is still pulling something out of me. And what is it in this moment?
You're a storyteller. You know how to tell stories. But in these exercises, it feels like a lot of it's narrative based. There's the story of Scripture, and the stories of the Gospels. There's also like the story of your own life. And like we're discerning how we show up and what our story is. A lot of people live in not a well-told story, like an ugly story. They live in a story where they're telling themselves that, hey, I'm writing this story and it sucks. Like it's just not a great story. How does this help us live into a better story and think about our lives as story, as God interacting with us, as we're the characters in it? How does story play into all of this, and how do we tell better stories to ourselves and the world? Hey friends, thanks for being here. Really, Shifting Culture isn't just a podcast. It's a community of people leaning in, asking deeper questions, and reimagining what's possible together. If the conversations here have meant something to you, would you take a moment to leave a rating or review? It helps others find us, and it's one simple way to support the show. You could also find more at shiftingculture.substack.com. That's where you'll get ad-free, early access episodes and some things I only share with subscribers. And if you got a creative project stirring in you, something that needs to be told, shaped, or shared, I'd love to walk with you in that. That's what we do at Shifting Culture Productions. Thanks again for listening. Let's get back to the episode.
Yeah, that's a great question. I am convinced, and this isn't my thought, this is a thought of someone else, like or a bunch of other people I've just kind of amassed in my mind. But I do think like one of the solutions to our current day is we need to tell larger stories, and we've lost our shared stories, and we have so many small stories, right? And if we're the only character in our small story, then like what a sad story that is. So how are we telling larger stories, right? And that's the role of religion. That's the role of movies, like, right? Like, like I always think of, I assume, I don't know, I never really had a water cooler, but like, right, when you're around like the proverbial water cooler and a person's like, hey, did you see this movie? Did you read this book? Have you played this video game? It's not just like idle talk. It's because you actually, a story meant something to you and you want to bring someone else into it, right? You want to share it with them. And I think there's a lot of power in that. And so we shouldn't dismiss, movies and books and things as trivial. I think God is at work in those. That's a God moment, right? These bigger stories. And I think so to your question, how can we tell better stories or think differently about our own stories? I go back to that idea of graced history, which is again this concept. There was a Canadian Jesuit named John English, and he talks about graced history as this review of our story in the company of an affirming and loving God, right? God affirming us in the review of our story. God not necessarily affirming all we've done. Certainly we've made mistakes. Certainly, things have happened to us that are terrible and traumatic. God isn't affirming of those things. God is affirming of our work going back through our story and trying to understand it, make sense of it, bring it to the light, right? I always like the image of kind of holding up the details of our story like a gemstone and holding it up to the light and looking at the different facets, right? What do we see differently as we move it around in the light? And then once we realize that our story matters, right? Once we say, oh my gosh, God has been at work in even the most mundane details of our stories, then we look to other people and say, oh, there's a lot of other people in this world. And we believe we're made in the image and likeness of God. I bet their story is also full of little details that point to profound truths about our existence. There's a wonderful quote from C.S. Lewis in The Four Loves that I always kind of bumble about here, but something to the effect of, he's talking about the love of friendship, right? Agape, that's the agape one, right? Not eros, agape. And he looks, right, the whole idea is the romantic love, you're looking into the eye of your beloved. But the love of friendship is you're looking out over a vista and you are sitting next to somebody and you may be looking at the same thing, but it's not until you name it, until you say specifically, oh my gosh, do you see that like Scooby-Doo van down there? That the person next to you can say, oh, what, you too? I thought I was the only one who saw that. And that's the way our stories are. That's the way it comes. That's what we do in our lives, by sharing the specificity of our lives with vulnerability in community. We can build that sense of, what, you too? I thought I was the only one. And then we begin to see how, though our stories are different, we see similar things. They can point to common truths, and we build out that shared sense of community. And I think that's there's many ways to think about storytelling, but that's the one that I've been kind of turning over in my head lately.
Stories are not just our own, that they're connected with one another and each other, that they're communal stories. And I think because we're in a moment where we're hearing the stories of the world, we're bombarded with so many different stories that don't help us be people of peace. It helps us be people of anxiety or of fear, anger, all of those negative emotions that come up because we're bombarded with really negative stories constantly. So what is the process, do you think, to share our story and others, to have this larger story, to connect it to a story of peace rather than fear and anger and betrayal and revenge, but actually the story of peace? What does that look like when we're bombarded with negative stories constantly? How do we do that with each other?
Oof, I wish I knew. I mean, it's so easy, and I do this all the time. That's why I know how easy it is to just get sucked into the headlines and to listen to one podcast after the next that's just telling you how terrible everything is, and it's, you got to be informed. That's an important thing too. But I think you have to have that kind of like beloved community in your own life. Like, it could be the people in your family, people you live with. It could be that wider sense of who's in your neighborhood. But I think there's a need to start locally and intimately. Like, who are the people that belong to you here? I think that's where you begin to share that story. I think also, I think a lot, like as a writer, right? And I write in a number of places and I have things come out every week. So there's sometimes it feels like I got to really mind the depths here. Like, what am I going to say this week? There's a real temptation to just share whatever. And that could really mean like, oh, I'm just going to perpetuate this sad, the doom and gloom, the chaos. That's not helpful, right? We have to always think with the words we say, whether we're saying them or putting them down on page or whatever we're doing, we have to say, what's good for God's people here? What is going to build up people, build up a sense of comfort? Not lie. We're not trying to lie or pretend or ignore. But from where I sit, I'm not a journalist. I'm not a political reporter. I'm not on the front lines of anything, right? But so what is important for me to say, to offer to the world that's going to be useful? And how can I do that in a way that is keeping in mind who's receiving this, right? Who is the audience? And again, that sounds very like marketing jargon, but it's true, right? I'm trying to offer something as gift to somebody else for their own spiritual nourishment. It just kind of carry them along the way a little bit. So I think always keeping our eyes, on the horizon of hope. How are we pushing people in that direction? Or not pushing, we never push, but walking with people in that direction is important. And I'll say one more thing. I was struck, I was listening to a podcast not too long ago, and someone was saying, the road to Emmaus, how long did Jesus walk in the wrong direction with his friends? And it was really struck me. I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, that's right. And so what does that mean for us? It doesn't mean we just blindly walk in the wrong direction forever, but there is a sense of, we know we're not always in the right direction, both of our own decision making and just the world, putting its needs on us. And yet, even out of that walking in the wrong direction, we can still be present intimately to people who are alongside us.
We have to really define peace. Some people think that peace can be weakness in this world because there's so much war that we actually have to have righteous violence to combat it. But peace is really, it's really strong. Jesus himself is peace. He's the Prince of Peace. He is peace. And he's not weak. I've never known Jesus as weak, but he was also nonviolent. What does peace as strength look like? And so help us and define this so we're not just weaklings in the world, but peace gives us strength in the world to move a different direction.
You cannot be a good moral leader or a prophet representing God if you are a liar or a lunatic. And by the things that Jesus said about himself, he couldn't be both of those things because he was either lying or he was out of his mind. And either one of those things would disqualify him to be the Lord of glory.
Yeah, I'm going to read. This is a definition that I use at the very beginning of the book, and it comes from John Deere, who is a Catholic priest and peace activist. He writes, "Peace begins within each of us. It is a process of repeatedly showing mercy to ourselves, forgiving ourselves, befriending ourselves, accepting ourselves, and loving ourselves. As we learn to appreciate ourselves and accept God's gift of peace, we begin to radiate peace and love to others." Now, again, that's starting within, but that radiating of love to others is really important, right? And I don't think any of us encounter somebody who's radiating love and says, what a weakling, what a jerk. I think we see in that person a certain kind of strength. It's a disarming strength. It's unsettling because it is, I think, standing against what the world often says is important. And this is key. This is a key meditation in the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, the two standards, right? Ignatius sets he sees two directions that we can go. We can stand under the standard of the enemy or the standard of Christ. Now, the standard of the enemy is marked by an unhealthy amount of attachment to riches and wealth, this desire and need for honors, and an overweening kind of bloated sense of pride. The standard of Christ is marked by poverty, rejection, humility, right? This downward mobility. Now, what happens? And again, you hear that and you say, boy, I don't want that Christ one sounds lousy. I don't want that one. And yet what happens, right? If I'm attached to riches, to honors, and to pride, there's no end. There's no end. I always want more. I always want more riches. I'm caught up in that. It's a struggle that I will never win. I never have enough, and there's always someone behind me on the ladder who's so much closer to overtaking me. I got to keep scrambling up, right? It's isolating. It abhors a community because it necessitates competition. Oh, I'm good now because I have more than you, but boy, oh boy, if you catch up to me, we're not going to be good anymore. It's violent. It's necessarily a violent way of living. On the other hand, and I'm not saying money is bad. I'm not saying an honor is bad. I'm not saying having pride in your work is bad. That's not what I'm saying. That's why I use those adjectives because it becomes your identity. It poisons you. On the other side, that direction that leads us to humility. It's disarming because we necessarily need other people, right? We recognize we are necessarily limited. We need community. We can't go it alone, and so the community expands. And in that exercise, in the meditation, Ignatius notes that Jesus calls us friends, right? The enemy calls us, we're foot soldiers, but Jesus calls us friends. I know this is a long answer to your question of to find peace, but the imagery is so important, right? Because it's a trajectory of our life. Every decision we make, we can run through this juxtaposition. Am I deciding this because I need money, I need honors, I need to be made to feel proud, or am I letting go and saying, you know what? I don't need those things. What's for the good of all people, right? A direction towards community. Now, peace. So what about is peace weakness? Well, I'm no hero of nonviolence. I think it's very scary, right? It's a very scary thing to embrace, and I write pretty honestly about that in the book. But our heroes of nonviolence, as we look at the world and look at our kind of our tradition here, their action, the action of putting yourself before kind of the tools of empire, right? It reveals the system around us is held up. Powers are held up necessarily by violence, right? We can't. It's not dialogue. It's not community. It's this: you do what I say, or ultimately, I got to remove you from the picture, right? And that's what these tools of nonviolence will ultimately, pull like pulling poison from a body, right? From a wound, it reveals it, and I think that realizes that then. the nonviolent person is ready to give their life. We see that in Jesus, right? That's what Jesus does on the cross. But it reveals the whole structure is built on sand. And what stands? That community of love, that community that is cares for one another. And hopefully everyone realizes, hey, I want to be in that. I want to be in the standard of Christ. I want to be part of the team that is looking out for each other, and not the team that is ready to kind of stab you in the back as soon as things go south. How's that for a definition?
But that nonviolence. So this is what I mean. I've been contemplating this a long time. I just never understand how nonviolence gets people so angry, and like,
Well,
and I what you just said is it pulls the poison out of the blood. I think is so helpful for me. Like, oh, they're they're poisoned. Like violence poisons people. Going after riches poisons people. Like following the way of the world poisons people. And nonviolence is an antidote to that. And the world hates it. Jesus died because of it. Martin Luther King Jr. died because of it. Like
right.
we could go example after example of people dying from it. But it's so good. It exposes the system for what it actually is.
Yeah, I think the silly example I give in the book is like a library. If you're too loud in the library, what happens? The librarian says to be quiet, and then if you keep doing it, what happens? Well, the librarian, probably calls somebody to come and remove you. Well, if you still, what happens? Eventually, it escalates, right? You get put in prison. You get threatened in different ways because the system is in some ways held up by this sense of violence. It's a silly example. And again, I am no hero of nonviolence. I find even in myself that anger sometimes that responds because we're conditioned to not want this stuff, right? I think there's you said think about definitions of peace. We often think of peace as simply the absence of violence. If no one's shooting at each other, then we must have a state of peace. That's not right. Peace, there's all sorts of kinds of violence. I think we've heard of structural violence, of course, but I think of cultural violence, right? There's this sense of what are those things that are considered common sense that are actually does harm to me or actually does harm to other people, right? Like, of course, like that person would never get a better job because, whatever. That's a form of cultural violence, right? And I probably could think of a better example, but I wonder if that's not in part what you're describing, the anger that people feel towards nonviolence, because we're conditioned to say, well, of course we would lead with the point of our guns. Of course we would. Why would we not do that? Because cultural violence that we've embraced unknowingly, And it's hard. It's not easy. None of this is easy stuff. And I'm not an expert, but I think there's a lot to pray about here, because ultimately we have to take it into our own lives, into our own contexts and live it here. Even just the words we say to describe ourselves. How often do I spill something? I go, "Oh, you idiot." That's not nice, right? That's a little bit of violence, right? Or if I say, "Oh, Eric, I'm so anxious today. I hate this part of me." That's violence. That's me trying to cut out a part of me, right? So there's a lot of ways to practice this in a very intimate context. We don't have to go to the front lines of anything. We can just sit in our rooms and think, boy, oh boy, where am I not cultivating this sense of nonviolence? And where have I given into some sort of cultural sense that it's okay to do it this way?
I really want to see this be what is in the world, is a real sense of peace, right? I want to see peace building in the world, and it's not weak. It is strong. It starts with us, that we have to cultivate a sense of peace within ourselves to get rid of the violence in ourselves. How does that move? How does this help us? These exercises help us move from a place of we're doing the work for ourselves and we're getting rid of the violence into a place of then building a community that does that work together, into a place then a wider neighborhoods and communities and cities actually then reflect that peace. What is the move of these exercises that could help us see this in the world, but it starts with us?
Well, first, everyone buys a copy of my book, and No, I think that's an essential question, right? And I think it's interesting because one of the key hopes of anyone who does the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius is this sense that we're profoundly changed in the world. But you have to find that balance. There is that balance between my own personal life of prayer and then my values in action. I think it comes down to the value of solidarity, right? The virtue of solidarity. It's one of the principles of Catholic social teaching. I think it necessarily begins within us, this idea of really having a firm and loving disposition towards people in completely different contexts of ours. How can we empathize in that way? How can we imagine ourselves living these other lives? I'm a pretty well-off guy living in Maryland, right? A lot of problems aren't mine, and yet it is my duty as part of the body of Christ, right? To think about who are those who are on the margins, who are most vulnerable, who are being demonized by society. Before I can care about those people, I have to put myself in their shoes and say, well, why is this happening? What is the story? Right? Go back to what you said earlier. What is the larger story we're not telling? That's solidarity. It's this firm commitment, and then from that say, okay, now I can better understand their stories and how it connects with my story. And now what does that mean? How do I spend my money accordingly? What do I do in my free time? How do I teach my children? Right? These are all things. What are the civic organizations I'm a part of? What do I do in my church context? All these things. I think that's where it begins. There's two chapters at the end of this book that I write that kind of that try to grapple with this idea of what do we do after the exercises, right? This is a pretty big question in the Ignatian tradition, and one of them is this. One of my answers, one of my suggestions is creativity, right? How are we fostering in ourselves a spirit of creativity? Not because we all need to go out and paint, although if that's yours to do, fantastic, but because a spirit of creativity allows us to hold kind of competing ideas, paradoxes in our mind, and not immediately need to rationalize them. We can say, you know what, there is a lot going on here, and I'm going to sit with it and allow it to percolate, much as Ignatius does, right, in those 11 months. And I'm going to allow there to be a sense of wandering in my discernment, in my prayer, and allow God to dream bigger than I might be already prepared to dream, right? And that's what the creative action is about, assembling something new out of the raw material we already have, right? It's that newness we need. So how do we do that? And then forgiveness. I think I have a chapter on there on forgiveness at the end, and it's very hard to forgive people nowadays, right? It's very hard to empathize. How do we see ourselves in that situation? Yeah, I don't know. Those might be lame answers, but that's kind of I think those like little we're working muscles. We're trying to build up muscles that can get us there. And then when we find ourselves with our friends, with our family, in conversation at at these key pivotal moments where we're making decisions, then we might instinctively move for peace rather than not realize kind of all the chaos that's going on in the world. It goes back to that first week of exercises. We have to see clearly the injustice and the violence that is here in the system, so that we can begin to act differently.
This story, for some reason, has been with me since the very beginning of our conversation, and so I think I need to share it just briefly. We were hanging out with this refugee family. The woman, Miriam, I'm going to call her Miriam, she got pregnant. She now has 9 mouths to feed if she has birth to this baby. They're war refugees. They have no money. They have nothing. And she's scared. She's worried. One day she asked my wife, Meredith, to go with her to Catholic Relief Office and say, hey, can I register for some aid and some different things? So Meredith went with her. And at the very beginning, what this woman, Miriam, said is, hey, I don't know how I'm going to feed this baby. I, jumped off of my bed and landed on my belly to try and abort my baby, to get rid of my baby. And so she's asking this Catholic Relief Services to pay for an abortion for her, which I found hilarious. But she right there has so much violence within herself, that so much like tension is, am I going to be okay? Is our family going to be okay? Is this baby going to be okay? Am I going to be loved? And as they said, no. And we went home with her. We started walking through stories of Jesus, and she started to find some hope that Jesus is with her, that there is some peace within her. And as we walk with her, she found forgiveness for herself, for God. She needed to forgive God for having her in this position. So she had this baby, and my wife was there, and they named him Glory, named him Majd, because it reminded her of the story of Jesus's birth. It reminded her of Jesus and the peace that he gave. And I don't know, it's just a transition from a place of like fear and anger and violence and just being absolutely scared as a refugee into a place of finding the stories of Jesus compelling, knowing that he is with her and giving her hope, and then reframing a new story, the story of, hey, the glory of God is going to be with us at all times, and we're going to live a different story. I don't know. I just found that a little piece of like, hey, this is kind of what it looks like, of moving into a new story, a new place, finding peace where there was an absence of peace before.
Yeah, and I love what you say too about like you name all those things, the fear and the anxiety and probably just the weariness and what does Jesus do with those? I don't think Jesus chases those out. I think Jesus comes in and gives them a hug, right? I think Jesus he wants us to hug these things. Those are part of us, right? And we I think we waste time by trying to chase parts of us away when we should be embracing them and saying, hey, you know what, you're here for a reason, but I don't need to be afraid right now. Or you're here, you've done good in the past, but I don't need to be anxious right now. How can we again realize that we're the beloved and that God delights in us, and that even in those hard moments, I think we're also Jesus weeps. I think that's one of the strongest parts in Scripture, right? Was and Jesus wept. And I think that's okay too. I think that's okay too. No, I think that's a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing that.
There's been so many times where we would just sit with people and just say, hey, Jesus wept.
Yeah.
And he's weeping with you right now. And just sit with people. Like, because what do you do with war refugees? Like you sit in the pain and the grief and the sorrow, and Jesus does that as well with us.
Yeah. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot is the idea of compassionate listening, and compassionate listening, not as I think it's taken me how many years of marriage to realize this, right? But like, listening isn't about like, oh, let me fix your problem. Like, you tell me, I'm going to fix it, and then we'll be off to the races. But instead, recognizing that we're all suffering, we're all hurting, and that compassionate listening is about how can I be with this person as they need to find some healing and some relief from that suffering, and how can my listening help to provide the space for that relief, rather than, all right, here it is, here's the solution, and that very recently, honestly, that's been in my prayer, and I was like, oh, this is actually really important. For me, like, to practice. This is an important thing for me to practice. I better pay attention to that. But I think it sounds like you've been doing that for a long time. So
not great at times, but sometimes I've been doing it all right. Just like we're all muddle onward. Yeah, exactly. A couple questions. This has been a fantastic conversation. I've absolutely loved talking with you.
Yeah, it's been so fun.
But I have a couple questions at the end. One, if you go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Oh, stay the course. Like it's like all of your weird, disparate interests are going to come together into your own vocation. So don't let any of those interests go away.
Anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
I just read Ursula Le Guin's Changing Planes, which essentially is a collection of like mini world building exercises. She just has, I think I don't know a lot about her. I know I like her writing, but it feels like mini spiritual world building experiences where each is like maybe like 15 chapters loosely held together by like a common framing device, but they each are just this, what if we exaggerated one kind of piece of humanity and put it into a different world and then kind of just saw what happened. It was really helpful. It was really powerful. It was a fun read. I just watched The Legend of Korra. I don't know if you're an Avatar guy, but I don't know if I loved it. I don't know if it's a kid's show. I don't know if it's worth recommending.
I'm sure it is. I've only heard good things of The Legend of Korra, so I've heard it's
Avatar, Legend of Korra. I'm excited for the next one. Yeah, I'm all in.
Is there a movie that you could think of that like kind of embodies what we've been talking about today that you could recommend?
Can I give you a scene? And it's a total plug for my other book, the Star Wars and Ignatian spirituality book, My Life with the Jedi, Spirituality of Star Wars. But I love it in The Last Jedi. Have you seen The Last Jedi? Are you a Star Wars guy?
Yeah, I love The Last Jedi.
Love Last Jedi. And so what happens, right? they think the answer is violence. They think the answer is we have to completely wipe out the First Order. And Luke, who himself has gone on this kind of spiritual journey and has to have his own discoveries, what does he do? It's not we have to roll over and play dead, and it's not we have to completely annihilate. He shows up and he fights Kylo Ren. He defeats Kylo Ren, but he's never actually there. There's never actually a threat of violence. I think that scene, that final duel, there's a lot to think about in what does that mean for our own work of peace and our own commitment to finding a third way, because that was surprising, right, in the movie, and people didn't like it necessarily. I did.
I wonder why. Do you think that that's why people didn't like it? Is it because it actually like goes against what the world thinks is like what revenge needs to look like?
I mean, maybe, right? Because I mean, we had a pretty clear image of revenge in like the ninth one, then followed up with like, nope. Turns out we just got to beat them all up. Well, and I think the other thing that was really I loved about The Last Jedi is because I also love Picard. I don't know if you're a Star Trek guy, but I love Picard because I like this idea of an older character, a hero we revisit years later, looking back at their legacy and realizing how many mistakes they made and how perhaps they have to re-examine what they've done. And yet they still have to rise to the needs of the moment. I love that kind of back and forth. And I think, again, I like what Luke did. So I think people didn't like that. I think they wanted Luke to be a perfect character from beginning to end, which is just not how characters go. And then the fact that Luke, right, it's important that Luke gives himself totally to that work, right? It literally kills him. It is the nonviolent path. So I think that's really important. Picard, he doesn't die in the end, spoiler alert, but that was also another great show. Which is not your question.
No, that's fantastic. It makes me want to go watch The Last Jedi again.
Yeah,
but
so good.
I also love Rian Johnson. I think Rian Johnson's amazing writer director, and so he's so much fun. So he's good. Anyways,
agreed.
How can people go out get Finding Peace Here and Now, which is a fantastic book. I really do hope people go out and read. This is one of my favorite reads that I've had in a while. You're an excellent writer, and these exercises can change your life. Like they really can, and they could bring about a place of peace that is desperately needed now. So I really do highly, highly recommend this book. So how can people get this book? And is there anywhere else you'd like to point people to?
Finding Peace Here and Now, How Ignatian Spirituality Leads to Healing and Wholeness, available May 6th. Anywhere you get your books, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, local bookstore. It's anywhere. The publisher is Brazos Press. My website is ericclaytonwrites.com. I have a weekly Substack you can find there. And I also have a weekly newsletter I do for the Jesuit Conference. I have some other books too. My Life with a Jedi, Spirituality of Star Wars, which if you liked my take on The Last Jedi, you're going to love that book. And then I have a whole book on Ignatian spirituality and storytelling called Cannonball Moments, telling your story, deepening your faith. So Ignatian spirituality, I really only have the one trick, so that's it.
That's good. It's a great trick. It's a really good trick.
I hope so. Thank you.
So it's good. Eric, thank you for this conversation. Thank you for diving deep into your own story, into Ignatian spirituality, into peace, into figuring out, hey, is there a better way and a new way that we could live in a subversive way that brings about the peace that we so desperately seek and need? So thank you. It was a fantastic conversation. Love talking to you. Wish we could do it more often. It was good.
Happy to come back. Thank you. It was a lot of fun.
All right. Thanks, Eric. Thanks for listening to this episode of Shifting Culture. This show was edited and produced by me, Joshua Johnson, at Shifting Culture Productions. If you're enjoying the conversations, consider supporting the work by subscribing at shiftingculture.substack.com. For as little as $5 a month, you'll get ad-free early access episodes and other exclusive content delivered straight to your inbox. I'd love for you to not just listen, but engage. Reach out. Share what's resonating, and let's keep shaping culture together. Whether you're a listener with feedback, a creative with an idea, or a brand looking to connect with a thoughtful, engaged audience, let's talk. If you're interested in advertising on the show, I'd love to hear from you. Contact me directly for rates and availability. Until next time, let's keep shifting culture.